History often remembers royalty through the lens of grandeur, glittering courts, political power, and fairy tale marriages. But hidden behind the gilded portraits are stories of pain, betrayal, and lost dreams. Such is the case of Princess Stéphanie Clotilde Louise Herminie Marie Charlotte of Belgium, a royal born into privilege yet destined for sorrow. Once considered one of Europe's most promising princesses, Stéphanie became the wife of Crown Prince Rudolf of Austria, heir to the mighty Habsburg Empire. But instead of ascending to the imperial throne, she was swept into one of the most infamous tragedies in European royal history, the Mayerling incident, a mysterious murder-suicide that claimed Rudolf's life and shattered Stéphanie's future. Reduced from imperial bride to royal widow in a single night, Stéphanie's life spiraled into obscurity, disappointment, and scandal. Her later years were marked by exile, strained family ties, and a controversial second marriage that distanced her even further from the aristocratic world she once belonged to. This is not just the tale of a fallen princess. It is a haunting portrait of a woman caught between dynastic duty and personal despair, between the twilight of empires and the dawn of modern Europe. This is the story of the forgotten Archduchess, born on May 21, 1864, in the opulent halls of the royal castle of Laeken, near Brussels. Princess Stéphanie Clotilde Louise Herminie Marie Charlotte of Belgium was the second daughter of King Leopold II of Belgium and Queen Marie Henriette of Austria. From her very first breath, Stéphanie was a symbol of dynastic alliance between two powerful European houses, the fledgling Belgian monarchy and the ancient, imperial house of Habsburg-Lorraine. Her birth was met with joy by the Belgian court, yet it was also overshadowed by her father's clear disappointment that she was not a son. Leopold II, a man obsessed with legacy and power, viewed daughters as political chess pieces rather than heirs of consequence. Nevertheless, Stéphanie was raised in the full splendor expected of royalty, surrounded by the finery of a court eager to prove Belgium's legitimacy on the European stage. Though steeped in privilege, Stéphanie's childhood was far from warm. Her father was emotionally distant and often cruel. He was consumed with expanding Belgium's influence, particularly through his brutal and secretive colonial exploits in the Congo, and rarely took interest in his children. Her mother, Marie Henriette, was herself a Habsburg by birth, and though she understood the cold formalities of court life, she found little emotional refuge in her marriage. She sought solace in horses and hunting, often retreating from her maternal responsibilities. As a result, Stéphanie and her siblings were primarily raised by governesses and tutors, in an environment more stifling than nurturing. Stéphanie was a bright and inquisitive child, fluent in French and German. With a classical education that included history, geography, music, and religious instruction. Her upbringing was strict, in line with 19th-century expectations of royal daughters, modest, obedient, and well-prepared for dynastic marriage. Though she enjoyed drawing and music, her personal interests were always subordinated to her future role as a consort. Emotions were discouraged. Curiosity was pruned. Above all, she was taught to be silent, graceful, and useful to her father's ambitions. From a young age, Stéphanie was paraded at court functions and royal ceremonies, where every move was scrutinized. While her elder sister, Princess Louise, was considered more rebellious and free-spirited. Stéphanie was labeled the good daughter, always poised, always proper. Behind her placid exterior, however, lay a young girl who longed for affection and purpose beyond ceremonial duty. Her early teenage years were marked by a series of carefully calculated decisions made by her father. As European powers vied for political alliances through marriage, Princess Stéphanie became one of the most eligible young women in Europe, not for her beauty or charm, but for the prestige her bloodline represented. When Emperor Franz Joseph of Austria and Empress Elizabeth, Sisi, began seeking a bride for their only son and heir, Crown Prince Rudolf, Stéphanie was quickly proposed as the ideal candidate. Though only 15 years old, and still emotionally unprepared for marriage, Stéphanie's fate was sealed. The Belgian court eagerly agreed to the match. For King Leopold II, it was a triumph. His daughter would become Empress of Austria, the pinnacle of dynastic success. For Stéphanie, it was the beginning of a life lived under the shadow of power, tragedy, and neglect. Before she even understood what it meant to be a woman, she was trained to become an empress. She would never return to the innocence of Laeken. As Stéphanie approached adolescence, her life became less her own and more a matter of diplomacy. In the grand chessboard of 19th century Europe, royal daughters were seldom left to dreams of romance. Instead, they were bartered as symbols of alliance, and Princess Stéphanie, well-mannered, pious, and politically convenient, was primed for such a fate. Her father, King Leopold II, had long aspired to elevate Belgium's position among the great European powers. What better way than to tie his daughter to the ancient and powerful Habsburg dynasty? When news reached Laeken that Crown Prince Rudolf of Austria, the only son of Emperor Franz Joseph I and Empress Elizabeth, was of marriageable age and in need of a suitable bride, the Belgian court quickly moved into action. Rudolf, however, was no ordinary prince. Bright, modern-minded, and highly educated, he was also melancholic, sensitive, and deeply at odds with his authoritarian father and emotionally distant mother. His liberal leanings clashed with the rigid conservatism of the Habsburg court. Rudolf's personal life had become increasingly unstable, marked by restlessness and rumors of affairs. His mother, Empress Elizabeth, harbored intense feelings about who her son should marry, and she initially opposed Stéphanie, dismissing her as too young, too plain, and too provincial, yet politics prevailed. The match had the advantage of strengthening ties between Austria-Hungary and Belgium. Despite Elizabeth's reluctance, and perhaps even Rudolf's own hesitations, the engagement was formally announced in March 1880. Stéphanie was just 15 years old. The girl who had scarcely emerged from childhood was now to be empress-in-waiting. To meet the stringent expectations of the Viennese court, Stéphanie underwent a crash course in etiquette, history, and the German language. She was also physically unprepared for the demands of marriage. Her body had not yet matured enough for conjugal life, a fact inconvenient to the machinery of royal planning. Nonetheless, her family, eager for the union, disregarded the warnings of physicians. Stéphanie was thrust into adult responsibilities before nature, or her heart, was ready. The wedding took place on May 10, 1881, at the Augustinian Church in Vienna, with the splendor befitting a future empress. The Austrian people were enchanted by the solemn beauty of the ceremony and the spectacle of royalty, yet beneath the glittering surface lay deep cracks. Rudolf, though courteous, remained emotionally distant. He admired Stéphanie's dignity and obedience, but he never loved her. Their union was one of duty, not desire. Moreover, he had already begun to immerse himself in the darker corners of Viennese society, seeking solace in drinking, intellectual debates, and extramarital affairs. His health, damaged by venereal disease, likely contracted during one of his numerous liaisons, soon became another strain on their marriage. It is believed that he infected Stéphanie early on, complicating both her health and future fertility. Stéphanie, for her part, tried to be the ideal Habsburg consort. She bore the rigid etiquette of the imperial court with patience, suppressing her emotions and submitting to her role. In 1883, she gave birth to a daughter, Archduchess Elizabeth Marie, nicknamed Erzi by the family. But the longed-for male heir never came. The birth of a girl, while celebrated publicly, only deepened Rudolf's dissatisfaction and isolated Stéphanie further within the suffocating walls of the Hofburg. Their marriage, never founded on affection, deteriorated rapidly. Conversations between the couple grew cold. Public appearances masked private estrangement. Rudolph's depression worsened, and Stéphanie's health declined. Still in her early 20s, she had become a ghost of the hopeful girl who had once arrived in Vienna with dreams of imperial glory. She had fulfilled her duty as a wife and mother, yet found herself emotionally abandoned, physically weakened, and surrounded by a court more concerned with appearances than with truth. What neither she nor the empire yet knew was that the shadows surrounding Rudolph would soon darken into tragedy, and that Stéphanie's life would never be the same again. When Princess Stéphanie of Belgium became Crown Princess of Austria, she stepped not only into a marriage but into the heart of one of the most formidable and complex courts in Europe, the Austro-Hungarian Imperial Court in Vienna. A place where grandeur masked rigidity, and where the emotional coldness of tradition could chill even the warmest spirit. The Hofburg Palace, with its endless marble corridors, formal etiquette, and hierarchical snobbery, was not a welcoming home for a young bride of 15. Stéphanie, though educated and naturally composed, was unprepared for the political and social intricacies of the Viennese court. Every gesture, every word, every gown worn in public was scrutinized and recorded. The expectations of a future empress were immense and unforgiving. She was closely watched by her father-in-law, Emperor Franz Joseph, who valued order, discipline, and propriety above all. Though he treated her with politeness, he offered little warmth. Her mother-in-law, Empress Elizabeth, Cece, to the world, remained distant, flitting in and out of court life, often traveling to escape the very institution that had made her an icon. She offered no guidance to her new daughter-in-law, seeing in Stéphanie a girl forced into the same gilded cage she herself resented. In the early years of her marriage, Stéphanie bore the weight of her role with silent resolve. She performed her public duties flawlessly, attending state events, entertaining foreign dignitaries, and presenting herself as the poised consort. But behind closed doors, her life was filled with loneliness and growing disappointment. Crown Prince Rudolph, once the symbol of hope for a modernized Habsburg monarchy, had become more aloof and disillusioned. His liberal ideals clashed violently with the reactionary politics of the empire, and he increasingly found escape in intellectual salons, alcohol, and women. Though he had moments of charm and attentiveness, he offered Stéphanie little emotional intimacy. The marriage quickly cooled, and the deep companionship that might have sustained them never blossomed. Despite this emotional distance, the imperial court anticipated the arrival of an heir. After several difficult years, on September 2, 1883, Stéphanie gave birth to a daughter, Archduchess Elizabeth Marie, named after her paternal grandmother and great-grandmother. The child was known within the family as Ursie, a sweet nickname, though a subtle reminder that she was not the longed-for male heir. The birth of Ursie was met with public celebration, but within the palace, there was quiet disappointment. Stéphanie had fulfilled her most important dynastic duty, producing an offspring, but it was not enough. A son was expected. Without one, her place at court remained fragile. Motherhood offered Stéphanie her only true joy. She adored Ursie and poured into her child the affection she herself had so rarely received. But even this bond was clouded by the tensions of court life and Rudolph's growing instability. He was a distant father, preoccupied with his personal demons and increasingly estranged from Stéphanie. Their private world was cold, even as they maintained the outward performance of harmony. The imperial court, for all its grandeur, offered no sanctuary. Stéphanie found herself more isolated than ever, unloved by her husband, watched by courtiers, and quietly undermined by a mother-in-law who saw in her the reflection of her own youthful misfortunes. Still, she endured. As the years passed, she cultivated poise, religious devotion, and an unshakable dignity. Yet beneath her quiet composure, Stéphanie remained deeply alone, her dreams fading under the weight of imperial duty and personal sorrow. It was a life lived in silk and silence, until, in the darkness of a hunting lodge in Meiling, the fragile world around her would shatter forever. Beneath the surface of imperial prestige and royal appearances, Crown Prince Rudolf was slowly unraveling. By the mid-1880s, the heir to the Austro-Hungarian throne was a man in crisis, physically ill, emotionally volatile, and politically disillusioned. For his young wife, Princess Stéphanie, the burden of his decline would become an unspoken tragedy, marking the slow and irreversible decay of their already fragile marriage. It began quietly. Rumors, whispered behind fans at court balls, spoke of Rudolf's affairs with actresses, courtesans, and noblewomen. What was initially dismissed as the harmless indulgence of a bored prince soon revealed deeper concerns. Rudolf's increasingly reckless behavior, his erratic moods, and his excessive drinking signaled something darker. His once celebrated intellect was giving way to despair. The truth, rarely spoken aloud in public, was devastating. Rudolf had contracted a venereal disease, most likely syphilis, during one of his many extramarital liaisons. In an era when such conditions were shrouded in secrecy and shame, especially within royal households, this revelation was catastrophic. The disease, progressive and incurable at the time, attacked not only the body but the mind. Stéphanie, still in her late teens, found herself exposed to this illness shortly after their marriage. She too suffered the consequences. Infection left her infertile, a cruel twist of fate for a woman whose value at court was so heavily tied to her ability to bear more children, especially a son. While the public never knew the full truth, her failure to produce additional heirs was a quiet scandal within the palace walls. The physical toll on Rudolf was severe. He suffered from chronic migraines, tremors, mood swings, and bouts of severe depression. As the disease progressed, his behavior grew increasingly erratic and unpredictable. Once praised for his progressive ideals and sharp intellect, Rudolf became isolated, bitter, and self-destructive. He clashed frequently with his father, Emperor Franz Joseph, whose stern traditionalism left little room for the prince's liberal hopes for reform. Rudolf's mental health deteriorated alongside his physical health. Haunted by political impotence, personal guilt, and the relentless expectations of empire, he spiraled into a state of despair. Friends and doctors alike observed his fascination with death and his growing obsession with the idea of suicide. Yet at court, silence prevailed. Publicly, he was still the bright hope of the Habsburg dynasty. Privately, he was a man on the edge of collapse. Stéphanie endured this decline with stoic grace. Though emotionally distant from her husband, she remained dutiful, ever conscious of her role as crown princess. Yet she lived in a home filled with shadows, a once promising husband slipping into madness, a court that refused to acknowledge the truth, and a future that had gone suddenly, terribly dim. The disease not only robbed her of her health and her chance to produce more heirs, it robbed her of the very foundation of her life. Her marriage had become a grim formality, her title a cage. As Rudolf's behavior grew more erratic, he began withdrawing from Stéphanie entirely. He surrounded himself with flatterers and lovers, seeking solace in dangerous liaisons and forbidden conversations. Stéphanie, once the chosen bride of the empire's heir, was now little more than a figurehead, unwanted, ignored, and quietly blamed for a life that was never hers to control. The once bright future of the young royal couple had withered into silence and disease, their lives a tragic prelude to the catastrophe that would soon shake the entire empire to its core. And in the hunting lodge at Meiring, that catastrophe would find its final, fatal act, on a bitterly cold morning, January 30, 1889. A messenger raced through the snow-covered forests outside Vienna, galloping toward the imperial court with devastating news. In a remote hunting lodge at Mayerling, Crown Prince Rudolf of Austria, the only son and heir of Emperor Franz Joseph, was dead. Beside him lay the body of Baroness Mary Wetzera, a 17-year-old noblewoman. The imperial future had ended in a double suicide, the most scandalous and tragic event to shake the Habsburg Empire in decades. For Princess Stéphanie, now just 24 years old, the news was more than a personal loss. It was the abrupt annihilation of her position, her purpose, and her identity. She was no longer the future Empress of Austria. Overnight, she became the Dowager Crown Princess, a title weighed down by mourning and political irrelevance. The events surrounding the Mayerling incident were immediately clouded in secrecy and distortion. The imperial court moved quickly to suppress the truth, fearful that scandal would erode the fragile stability of the monarchy. Official statements claimed Rudolf had died of natural causes. The church resisted granting him a proper burial, believing suicide to be a mortal sin. Only through the emperor's intervention, and the manipulation of facts, was Rudolf laid to rest in the imperial crypt of the Capuchin Church in Vienna. But whispers could not be silenced. The full horror of the event leaked into salons and newspapers across Europe. Rudolf had shot Mary Wetzera, then turned the gun on himself. Whether this act was one of desperation, her daughter, Archduchess Elizabeth, became the symbol of what might have been. Yet even this bond would grow fraught in years to come. Ursie, spirited and strong-willed, inherited not her mother's steadiness, but her father's restlessness. Their relationship, once close, would erode over the decades, another wound carved by the Mayerling tragedy. In the public, Stéphanie retreated with grace. She toured Hungary, attended charitable events, and maintained a quiet presence in court society. But within, she was a woman untethered, no longer wife, no longer heir, no longer beloved. In a single, irreversible moment, Mayerling had taken more than a husband. It had taken her future. And yet, against all expectation, this was not the end of Stéphanie's story. It was the end of her royal identity, but the beginning of a second life, one lived far from the shadow of empire, and marked by defiance, scandal, and a final, surprising love. When Princess Stéphanie walked away from the cold marble halls of the Hofburg, she left behind more than a palace. She stepped out of a life defined by duty, silence, and ceremonial grief. The death of Crown Prince Rudolf had severed her from the Austrian throne, and with no male heir to secure her place, Stéphanie became a royal widow without a kingdom. But in the vacuum left behind, something remarkable began to stir, the slow and painful rebirth of her individuality. At just 24, she had lost her husband, her status, and the future she had been groomed for since adolescence. Now carrying the title of Dowager Crown Princess, she lived in a peculiar limbo, not quite a political figure, not quite a private citizen. She resided for a time in Budapest, where she was treated with more warmth than in Vienna, and where her reserved dignity found some measure of appreciation. Still, within the Habsburg orbit, she remained a ghost, politely acknowledged, quietly disregarded, but Stéphanie was not content to remain in mourning. Over time, she began shedding the layers of imperial expectation that had long suffocated her. She turned to writing, producing memoirs and correspondence that revealed a surprisingly sharp, reflective mind. Her tone was not bitter but honest, tinged with sadness, yet fiercely aware of the personal cost she had paid to serve a dynasty that had never truly embraced her. In the late 1890s, the court was scandalized by a new chapter in Stéphanie's life, one that could never have unfolded had she remained an Austrian royal. She had fallen in love. The man was Count Elmer Lonier de Nagilonia Iti Vassaros Namini, a Hungarian nobleman with no royal blood, no political importance, and no connection to any court. He was, by Habsburg standards, utterly unsuitable. And that, perhaps, was part of the appeal. With him, Stéphanie found warmth, companionship, and, for the first time, romantic love freely chosen. The decision to marry him was unthinkable in imperial circles. Emperor Franz Joseph disapproved, and Stéphanie was forced to give up her imperial titles upon marrying beneath her rank. She was no longer Her Imperial and Royal Highness. She became simply Princess Stéphanie of Belgium, and later, following her marriage in 1900, Countess Launier. What she lost in title, she gained in freedom. She and Elmer withdrew from public life and settled at Rozov's castle, then in Hungary, now in Slovakia, where they lived quietly, surrounded by books, nature, and each other. Stéphanie dedicated herself to intellectual pursuits, gardening, and local charity work. She embraced Catholic devotion and cultivated friendships outside the world of politics and protocol. By the 1920s, Princess Stéphanie, now Countess Stéphanie Launier, was a woman removed from the world of power, yet quietly enduring in a life far richer in peace than any she had known at court. She spent her final decades at Rozov's castle, a stately estate nestled near the Danube, not far from modern-day Bratislava. The castle, with its neo-Gothic towers and sprawling gardens, became her sanctuary. Within its stone walls, Stéphanie found solace in simple pleasures, reading, walking in the gardens, tending to local charities, and engaging in thoughtful correspondence. The woman who had once stood beside a crown prince now lived in elegant obscurity, surrounded by memories and ghosts. She remained married to Count Elmer Launier until her death. Their marriage was quiet, respectful, and enduring, proof that love, though found late and against expectation, could still bring light into a life once marked by sorrow. He was her confidant, protector, and loyal companion until the very end. In the political turmoil of the 20th century, Stéphanie remained a distant observer. She watched as World War I destroyed the Austro-Hungarian Empire that had once been her adopted homeland. She saw the rise of new nations from the ashes of old monarchies, and the fall of many of the royal houses she had once belonged to by birth and marriage. After the war, her financial situation became more modest, but she was never poor. Her needs were simple, and her dignity intact. Occasionally, she would receive visitors or write to old acquaintances, but she never sought the limelight again. She rarely spoke publicly about Mayerling, and never exploited her royal past for gain. Her estrangement from her only child, Archduchess Elizabeth, remained unresolved. Ursi had defied imperial expectations, married outside the nobility, and embraced left-wing political ideologies. Stéphanie, ever rooted in old-world values, could not understand her daughter's rebellion. Their relationship, once tender, had faded into silence. It was a private grief she carried into her later years, one final loss among many. As World War II broke out, Stéphanie was already in her late 70s. The Second World War brought chaos even to her quiet retreat. The castle at Rozov's was eventually seized by the Soviet Red Army in 1945 during their advance through Eastern Europe. By then, Stéphanie was ill and frail, a living relic of a vanished empire. She died on August 23, 1945, at the age of 81, just days after the end of the war in Europe, and a world away from the palaces of her youth. The once crowned princess of Austria, daughter of the King of Belgium, widow of the tragic Rudolf, was buried in Pannonhalma Archabbey, Hungary, beside the man she had chosen freely, Elmer Launier. There were no imperial funerals, no global mourning. She passed quietly, with few headlines. Yet hers was a life of rare complexity, spanning the full arc of a Europe that transformed from empire to ashes. Today, she is often remembered only in the footnotes of Habsburg history, overshadowed by the drama of Mayerling and the myth of Empress Elizabeth. But for those who look closer, Princess Stéphanie's story is not merely one of tragedy, it is one of endurance, reinvention, and unexpected strength. Princess Stéphanie of Belgium's life was a story of profound contrasts. Born into royalty, wedded to a prince whose tragic fate would shape her future, cast aside by an empire that no longer needed her, and yet, ultimately, reborn into the quiet dignity of an independent woman. While the world around her shifted in dramatic upheavals, she remained steadfast, perhaps not by choice, but by necessity. Her life exemplified survival, resilience, and the complex layers of duty, grief, and personal reinvention. Her early years, filled with grand expectations and courtly splendor, were overshadowed by the emotional wreckage of a failed marriage and the devastating loss of her husband, Crown Prince Rudolf. The Mayerling tragedy marked the end of a hopeful future and the beginning of a life marked by isolation, loss, and misunderstanding. Yet she never allowed herself to be defined solely by the tragedy that befell her. Instead, she sought solace and meaning in a second marriage to a man who saw her as more than just a royal title, Count Eleanor Lonier, with whom she lived a quiet, fulfilled life outside the limelight. Stéphanie's estrangement from her daughter Ursie and her struggle to reconcile with the changing political landscape of Europe were marks of a woman out of sync with the world she once knew. But perhaps the greatest testament to her legacy is that she was able to create something for herself in the ashes of the life she was born into. She lived on her own terms, choosing to love when it was least expected and embracing simplicity when surrounded by the complicated remnants of her royal past. In her final years, Stéphanie became a reflection of the changing Europe, one that had witnessed the fall of empires, the shifting of borders, and the erosion of traditional monarchies. She may not have been a ruler or an iconic figure in the grand sweep of history, but her resilience in navigating the labyrinth of royalty, grief, and personal transformation is a legacy in itself. Her story, largely forgotten by those who fixate on the imperial glamour of the past, deserves a place in the chronicles of royal history. A woman who began as a princess, lived through the splendor and shadows of empire, and ultimately, found peace away from it all. Princess Stéphanie's life is a poignant reminder of the quiet strength required to survive the unrelenting tides of fate.